Good evening and welcome to a new season of Perspective, your opportunity to get the point of view from the journalist behind the story. I'm Kathy Hicks, the news director for Hicks and Q93 Radio in St. John's, and I'm joined by my colleagues tonight, and we hope that we're in for a lively discussion. To my immediate right is Ted Warren, the city editor of the Evening Telegram in St. John's. Next to Ted is Deborah Nobes, a reporter with the Express newspaper in St. John's, and Brett Loney, the news editor of the Evening Telegram. Brett and Ted, of course, we've all been together for the past couple of seasons, and Deborah is joining us tonight for the first time. Welcome, Deborah. Well, we've got a number of issues to get through tonight. First, from what has become an incredibly emotional issue that started in a small Newfoundland town of Angley. It's all about statements of support for a convicted rapist teacher there. Very emotional. We'll get to that. We'll also take a look at the Civic Center for St. John's. Will we, should we, can we get a Civic Center? And as well, the Auditor General's report that says to the former Tory government in Ottawa, my, oh my, what a mess you made out of shutting down the fishery. And I suppose we should, start with the Auditor General's report because it is it comes down quite hard, saying a number of things, saying it's illegal, the NCARP package itself, and also that, things were done too quickly, there was wasted money, millions in fact, about 15 million. What Ted, are your thoughts on what the Auditor General has had to say?
Well, when you mentioned the point about the legality of the program or whether there was proper authorization, I think that's primarily a procedural point, and it's not. It's an issue that would be important to an auditor, but perhaps not as important to an outside observer who didn't have that kind of perspective. The question of waste, I don't think, is any surprise to anybody in this province. We all have our own personal stories of people who are qualified or who are not qualified, but who are receiving NCARP benefits, or people who had a very questionable attachment to the fishery. I think there's not much doubt that the auditor was spot on when he said it was done in a rush, and it certainly was done in a rush.
I think that point was made, though, when it was first announced. John Crosby had said at that time that things are going to be very rushed, folks, but we've got to get the money out there, and some felt that they would have a riot on their hands to shut down the fishery and not to at least pay something out right away.
Well, that's not surprising, but the problem with it was that Crosby thought, I think, initially that they'd get the program in place and then fine-tune it and fix it. Well, once they started sending the checks out, every time they did anything to jeopardize those checks to any individual, there was an uproar. So nothing actually happened. The people, I think, for the most part, who got checks on the first week continue to get checks.
But the Auditor General is also saying, though, that there are some people still out there getting checks that should not be receiving these payments.
Yeah, that's true, and I think that the interesting thing about this whole story is going to be, now that the Auditor General's report is down, now that it is critical of the NCARP program, is the timing of this report, coming as it does, with only months left in the current NCARP program, with all kinds of discussion and talk about what might replace it. It makes for a difficult situation, or perhaps an easier situation for a government that's looking for an alternative. After this kind of criticism of the current NCARP, does it perhaps let the Liberal government off the hook a bit in terms of what it plans for the future? So I think that's the interesting thing, is that it raises, criticism at a critical time. When the Liberal government is trying to figure out where do they go from here. Do they go with an income supplementation program? Mm-hmm. Do they go with some sort of refined or reduced NCARP? What do they do? And to have, stories of waste, and perhaps even as the Wire stories are sort of half suggesting perhaps dead people receiving NCARP,
yeah.
The possibility that
people who've left the country, people who got out of the fishery.
It is a tricky time for it to come down, and that's politically that should be quite interesting how they handle it.
And it does give Brian Tobin certainly an opportunity now to express to everyone. You see, I had complained about these things before, and I had brought up some of these situations before that he had wanted corrected at that time, and now. So it's a real opportunity for him to not only clean things up, which he has to anyway, and he knew that he would be forced to have to clean things up, but now he can, he can set the pace for how the new negotiations are going to go, if indeed there will be any negotiations. Perhaps the decisions have already been made.
I kind of disagree with what you're saying. Just judging by the Liberals' track record so far with their throne speech, they're pretty much sticking to what they promised in their campaign, and I think there was a definite commitment to keeping the NCARP money coming in for the fishermen. I think they were really trying to, and also making Brian Tobin Fisheries Minister, who was also saying, well, we care about what's going on, we really have to keep the money flowing in there until we get a real plan. I don't think that Chrétien will, or even Tobin will really pay too much attention to what the Auditor General has been saying, because he made such a pre-election commitment, and I think that helped the Liberals in this province federally anyway.
But I mean, it's a question of degree here too. Tobin made a commitment during the campaign to act, some would suggest, he'd said within 90 days on foreign overfishing. Well, Tobin will tell you today that he's acting on foreign overfishing and he's meeting that commitment, but he's not meeting the commitment that people had perceived him to have made in that campaign. By the same token, they'd made a commitment to continue support for people displaced by the moratorium. But how do you define support, and how does that support stack up against the program which exists now? A lot of people have, up to now, interpreted that commitment as meaning the NCARP program or some similar deal will be negotiated to provide roughly equal compensation. I think that's still open to question, and if too much of this talk of waste gets abroad in Ottawa, I think the successor program may not be nearly as rich as the one it's replacing.
And I think that's what we have to look at here. $600 million were spent on NCARP. They estimated 15 million had been wasted, perhaps. They still don't know where all the wastage is. But when John Crosby had even warned about that in the beginning. We've already mentioned that. But more than the money, there are 2 points here. Newfoundlanders, we've been through it all. We have seen it happen. We've seen it unfold. We knew that there was a rush. We could see, the strain on the system to say, let's move and let's get something done now. But I think you're right. I think the national media will have more than a heyday with this because they perhaps would not have as much compassion. And the other point on all that is, besides the money, the AG report makes it very clear that this government was just simply not organized and unprepared for that fishery shutdown. And I think that's a point that's got to be made, because that very much points the finger at Ottawa to say, that's glaring mismanagement there. You knew that the inshore fishery was not going to was not in good shape, yet you allowed it to go ahead.
Well, and there's an added factor here too, and that's the fact you have to consider who the official opposition is here. The official opposition is the Reform Party. The Reform Party is looking at, wastage in government spending, is worried about the deficit and the debt. And the Bloc Québécois is the unofficial official opposition. And so you can't necessarily see either of these two groups being, overly sympathetic to the issue, while they may be sympathetic to the problems of Newfoundland fishermen. I mean, this is an issue that won't necessarily, I don't think, engender their entire sympathy. So I think it'll be interesting to see what the Liberal government does. I mean, they obviously have made some form of commitment, but the question is, what does that translate to in actual dollars come May?
Okay, let's look at the one point of it being illegal as well, to be able to be paying out this kind of money when the enabling legislation had not been passed through the Commons. I mean, what can be done about that
That's
now?
kind of a moot statement right now. They can't do anything about that now. That's just, I think that's a central Canadian attitude coming out saying, not to put anybody down who's from central Canada, but who just does not understand the human scale of what was happening here at the time, and obviously wasn't at the press conference when they had the battering rams going at the doors of the Radisson Hotel. I mean, something had to be done right away. There had to be money right away, and obviously something had to be done. There was money that needed to come here, so I mean, for him to say, oh, it's illegal, it's like saying, oh, the sky is blue. It just doesn't have any bearing on anything.
All right. So, okay, you ready to move on from the fishery? Or do we want to talk about the $4 million plan? Now, that had, first of all, when we get an AG report, we're talking about $600 million that had been paid out. It was an $800 million package. And then just last Friday, we all get the package come to our respective newsrooms. Without a figure attached, in fact, of the value of the new program improving our odds. $4 million, and the Evening Telegram had said to shoot the breeze, $4 million, and certainly a lot of emotion coming out of that. Many see it, is it wastage? Is this pure and simple wasting $4 million?
Well, it's hard to conceive of a definition of training that would include sitting around for 8 hours a day and having open-ended discussions on future prospects. That's stretching it to call it training, and that's one of the things that's been wrong with NCARP and with the South Coast compensation package. That training has been elevated to some kind of a pedestal as an objective, training and retraining, but there's been no kind of a firm definition of exactly what training is. So training in this context becomes sitting down and having a coffee with your neighbors. Well, you know, more power to them. I mean, there's an obvious need for people to sit and consider their futures, but whether we should
for it?
put out $4 million in taxpayers' money and refer to this as a training program, I think is a little thick, really.
Now, it has to be understood that this came from the Human Resources Department as well, not necessarily from fisheries, but directed toward fisheries.
Well, and the fishermen aren't even happy with it. I mean, you know, one of the fishermen told one of our reporters, I mean, this is like being in prison. You know, you go in there for 8 hours a day and you're forced to sit around and drink coffee after coffee after coffee and talk about nothing. I mean, it's not something...
I can take that for
No, I
at
mean,
least
you know,
a
I mean,
day.
on the face of it, it sounds like, well, God, wouldn't we all? But I mean, you know, these guys, that's not. I mean, they see it as a waste. I
They
mean,
don't exactly talk about their feelings. Fishermen aren't known for
exactly.
their...
But I mean, you know, they don't want it either. I mean, you know, they realize it's silly and ridiculous as much as anyone does.
So is there a message coming out of this? I mean, is anyone listening? Is Ottawa listening to this?
I think it's just an excuse. This is what it sounds like to me. It's an excuse to give these people more income, and they didn't really know what to do with it. So, well, here you go. Figure out what you want to do with your life. And
It's also been union sort of prompted as well, you know, because the unions have been certainly concerned about their own membership and making sure that there's still an interest there. At least there's some financial gain, you know, coming from fisheries because of the shutdown fishery. And Earl McCurdy, in fact, made it very clear, excuse me, that it doesn't necessarily mean that this money is going to be spent. So
Yes, but in a lot
kind of shy about that now, I think.
In a lot of cases, it's hard to know exactly where the fishermen's union's interest really is, because in a lot of the training programs, they're being delivered on contract by the union. And in fact, that's keeping money flowing into and out of the union coffers at a time when the Jews have dried up, and they're really sustaining the union as well as the fishermen with some of these programs.
Okay, we want to move on a little bit now, but I think that maybe we'll make the point over the next week. We're going to hear a lot more from the unions. In fact, a lot of discussions about loans and banks, you know, starting to lean on some of the fishermen to repay some of their loans on the boats, even suggesting that perhaps they put up their house for collateral. Also, the union, they're going. At least the FFAW, the Fishermen's Union, is going on a trek across the province to many towns on a membership bid, also to talk about the income supplementation program. So perhaps for next week's session we will have a lot more to talk about with the union itself. Englee, small town, Northern Peninsula. It's been incredible, I think, the emotion that has come out of this issue. It's a familiar case of sex abuse, but I say familiar in a small town because Newfoundlanders, by and large, you know, since Mount Cashel, so many of these cases have come up, so they are familiar with sex abuse cases from teachers, from priests, from people in authority in the community. But this one took a whole different turn, and it was prompted out of an article in the Evening Telegram from the principal of the school. Why so much emotion here?
I think a lot of what the principal was trying to get across was, I think, protectionism. He was trying to protect his town from having this bad black mark from this teacher to the outside community. I think when you have a small, remote community, you have a tendency to want to keep the dirty laundry inside, and I think that's why he made those comments to the newspaper. And
was he thinking?
I don't think
Obviously
necessarily
not.
thinking about the ramifications.
Not the ramifications.
That's another, you know, part of being, I mean, you look at the mayor and the principal of the school have the same last name, and it's the same name as of the school. That's right. So you got to think about how big this community is, and who are the power players in the community, and why this principal would want to protect the image of the community outside. I think that's why he was making those comments. But
And it's ironic, I think, that yes, you're probably quite right that that's what motivated him. But at the end of the day, it's had the reverse effect. Rather than defend the community, it's perhaps given the community a second black eye.
Sure, and I think it's really quite divided the community. I mean, the community is still smarting from the abuse itself, and certainly, you know, we haven't heard the end of this story. There were many angles on this story, many areas to look at, but one certainly are the further allegations, you know, and that there was more widespread, perhaps.
Well, I think the thing that I found the most disturbing about it is, I mean, I have to admit, I was relatively disturbed by the comments of the principal. I mean, I don't think they were taken out of context, and maybe they're out of a misguided sense of loyalty to this individual teacher or not. But what I found particularly disturbing was the comments on CBC television of some of a couple of the students in the community that were saying, you know, this teacher's still a fine man, and this should have been handled in a different way, and that. And I mean, maybe it's just innocence or whatever. But I think, I mean, if there's a lesson to be learned, let's hope it can be learned within in that school itself about abuse, about support for victims as opposed to the aggressor. And I think the fact that the students hadn't picked up on that, to me, was more disturbing than anything, particularly since it was people that had been in the same place as they had been. And what it points to is maybe we're not doing as much education in this area as we think we are, and that we should maybe be doing it more, not just in Anglia, because I'm sure this is a situation in all sorts of communities in Newfoundland and across the country, in St. John's and everywhere else. And I think it sort of points to the fact that, well, we think we maybe have done lots in this area, maybe we really haven't.
Well, I think in this case, government and the school board authorities in particular have to be seen to be doing something about this. I don't think we can just let the furor die down and let it all wash away. I mean, I'm not suggesting for a moment that you start running around firing people, but I think some pretty affirmative action is in order here.
Well, there is, the principal, the school board itself certainly is looking into not only the statements coming from the principal, because there is that line there too, the freedom of speech, but I think what was most disturbing for many people as well, and certainly for Education Minister Chris Decker, who himself finds himself in a very difficult situation because he's the MHA for that area, was when he had seen the teacher standing over the student who was writing a letter of support to the convicted rapist teacher, George O'Reilly, and he was very appalled was the word that he used to describe how he felt, because he felt it's really hard to imagine that there wasn't any sort of coercion or coercing going on there. And so we're all very concerned about what's happening within the classroom. But I think most of the comments that I was hearing and getting was that, haven't we learned anything from Mount Cashel, from some of the other cases, like the victim is the victim is the victim. And even this story, it prompted and forced the victims to come out. And there was so much fallout from this, and the fallout will continue. The town itself, no doubt, it will be divided. You've got the people, that are rallying around George O'Reilly, and they certainly, I'm sure, never expected this. But that town will be divided. The mayor is very upset, for sure.
Well, I think we run the risk as outsiders in the media of painting the whole town with a brush that perhaps is not really appropriate. I think that in the rush to cover the story and to develop the story and follow the story as it develops, that perhaps there's a tendency to associate people who had something good to say about this particular individual, this teacher, with the principal's remarks that he would have no problems with this teacher going back into the classroom. And I think there's a line here, and the principal has definitely crossed it, but I'm not sure the people of the community have.
Sure. We recall, the number of court cases that have been developed even just from people, who they have their own beliefs, and, about the Holocaust, for example. And we've seen that in court all the time. So that's where the lines get drawn.
On the flip side of this one, too, is just, this is the kind of story that makes people upset about the media. I mean, not only people on Anglia, but also other people saying, well, so he made one comment to one reporter, and what's the meaning in it? But I think this is an example of where the media can do positive things, too. I mean, the fact that was said was an indication that this hadn't really been sort of meshed out a bit in the community, the community of Angli, the community in general in Newfoundland, and that maybe, you know, we have some more things to learn about this whole issue, and if we don't do those kind of stories, then no one has to grapple with things we haven't really grappled with. And I think while there's upsides and downsides to every story that the media does, this is an example of the things we can
learn still.
Sure.
And look what we're learning still.
Yeah.
I think the victim who ended up writing a letter to Chris Decker asking for an inquiry, I don't think she would have come forward as strongly as she did if there hadn't been the media coverage, if there hadn't been the sense in the outside community that, well, this was wrong, what happened, something should be done here. So
for her to be prompted to come out, even, you know, and
or the woman on CBC television, I mean, you know, who's putting her picture and name before it and saying, I can't move back to Newfoundland or to Angli or visit Angli because of this. People in the community have to understand that, you know, sure, this Mr. O'Reilly might have been the finest fellow in the world as a person. I mean, obviously he did some atrocious things, but we have to understand that some of these victims were the finest people in the world too, and they carry this forever as well.
Sure, they had a just defeat in their very small victory. There is one area I wouldn't mind talking to you about, though, and finding out just the perspective of the reporter who had initially written the story. I mean, a reporter takes responsibility no matter what, no matter which story it writes, no matter where, but this was, I think if I were the reporter doing that initial story, I would have some sleepless nights, perhaps, you know, just out of concern for, look what this had generated, you know, because the reporter was responsible for quoting the principal and had built its story on the quotes from the principal. What on the reporters, and what kind of stress levels are there? What can we look at there? All part of the job?
I think I would feel irresponsible if I heard comments like that coming from someone and I didn't report it, especially someone in the position of the principal. You know, it's our job to make sure people know what's happening, you know.
But when it generates this much emotion and you know it's all coming from your comment, what happens to the reporter?
Anyway. It was going to happen anyway if it wasn't. If I were the reporter, I'm not even in the news organization who did it, but if I were the reporter who was covering the story, someone said that to me, I mean, especially because it was going to generate that kind of emotion, because that kind of emotion would have just laid buried inside, because everyone would have known that this principal felt this certain way about this, and it would have come out, you know, and there has to be some kind of justification in the public, and I would have done it no problem.
After writing that story, I think the reporter responsible went home feeling pretty good.
Yeah,
that he'd done a good day's work, quite frankly.
All right. Okay, ready to move on to the Civic Center. Should we, can we, will we, would we?
Not unless we get win a lotto or something.
Yes, maybe, no.
Yes, no, maybe. So we had a game like that as kids. The Civic Center, I mean, there's lots of discussion about the infrastructure program, and we know that John Murphy is saying, no, I'm not going to put that on the list of things, you know, under this infrastructure program coming out of Ottawa. We have to find another way. I mean, is it feasible? Will St. John's get a civic center, and will St. John's get it soon?
Everyone's mouths open.
I think there's a lot of factors involved, and I think finally through our media outlet and other media outlets, now we're all starting to get on this story a little bit more, and I think there's finally more and more information becoming public so that there can actually start to be some informed public debate about it. It's all been based almost solely on what the provincial government, the City of St. John's had their own study on the issue. It came forward with certain ideas, certain proposals. Whether or not it would be feasible was based on numbers that have come out of this study. Our organization and other organizations are starting to do stories on this issue that suggest other numbers about its feasibility, and I think finally people in St. John's are going to be able to start to see alternative ideas and alternative views of how successful this will be, because the bottom line is from Jennifer Smith, who did the story for us, from what she found, almost every similar kind of proposal or civic center / convention center operating in Atlantic Canada has to be subsidized, some to the tune of almost $1 million a year. And this is not what the City of St. John's was told about their proposal. They were told, in fact, that it would make $2.3 million a year. I mean, so these are very...
revenue. That would be net revenue.
Yes, I mean, these are very, very different numbers. So I think now the debate is open.
Yeah, and John Murphy was saying he would be prepared to go, what, not more than $250,000 a year, because a subsidy is not entirely wrong, because there are so many spin-off
Sure.
effects, and just the publicity itself for the city.
Sure.
I like to be an optimist about this, because I think that the spin-off effects from the center in Halifax, Fredericton, Sydney, all these centers are really positive for the downtown areas. I think it's a terrific idea to have it if we could find a way to learn from everybody else's mistakes and make at least a break-even venture. I think it's almost necessary.
Well, I
Last
think-
point to Ted.
I think you've got to have, to go out of projects like this, you've got to have a realistic idea of what the financial implications are. And it's not a situation where you can say, if it's not going to make a buck or if it's not going to pay for itself, it's not a good idea. I don't think it's as open and shut as that. But I think if you go into it expecting to make a profit, you perhaps build a much different facility than if you go into it looking at it more realistically and say, well, it's going to require a subsidy, but it's good for the city. This is what we're going to do, and this is why we're doing it.
So, public meeting next Thursday night. I think it is next January 27th at least. Look for where this public meeting is, and you may want to go out and have your say. My gosh, where did the night go? It's gone. I want to thank you so much for joining us this evening, Brett, Deborah, and Ted. And if you have a comment to make, if there's something of interest here, if you want to know more, if you have a suggestion on something we should be talking about, write us, Perspective, P.O. Box 8596, St. John's. The postal code is A1B, as in Brett, 3P2, and our fax number is 722-8384. Perspectives. Have a good night. Thank you.